It's like, how do we respond? And I find myself talking about Christianity a lot, which is very surprising to me, at least, because it seems to me that part of what's happening is that there's a destabilization that comes from the loss of the church. And you were talking about the idea that science and democracy, like, they have to sort of coexist. And I've come to think, like you talk about the idea of opponent processing, right? We need these opponent processing systems. Mm-hmm. I think that the church has played an enormously important role as part of that. It stabilizes aspects of individual cultivation that neither science nor democracy do, right? It's like you can't have democracy or science that work well unless you have something that attends to the cultivation of the moral fabric of the individual. And neither science nor democracy actually do that well or should do that well. There's something that has to exist within a society to do that fits these other things. And you could argue that Christianity has failed in some way to do that, at least recently, or that it was never as good as we would like it to be, and that we can do something better. And I think that there's truth to that. And yet also, like I've said from this other perspective, I think it's really Lindy, and we need to harvest the wisdom from it, and we need to recognize what was lost. So I think it's like, that's the story, right? It's the story that I understand on some level, and I felt it transform me. Like, I am deeply impressed by aspects of Taoism and aspects of Buddhism, but I don't feel like the story it's not to say that it doesn't, right? Because in some sense, I think of Jesus as a man who was willing to die for us, and Buddha as a man who was willing to live for us. And I think those are both wonderful examples of the hero. Like, the Buddha had the chance to be enlightened, and he chose to come back to the world and experience the suffering of the world. And that's the archetype of the Bodhisattva. And I think that there's so much that we can gain from being in relationship to the archetype of the Bodhisattva as well as the archetype of Christ, right? But in some sense, the story, for whatever reason, I've simply been more compelled by the story. Mm-hmm. And that's come against immense resistance, because I grew up in a counterculture community where Christianity is the bad guy. Mm-hmm. And my experience of Christianity when I was young was of evangelical, charismatic Christianity that was very anti-science. And then I went to a place of being essentially a new atheist, right? Like, I think there's a whole generation of us who spent a lot of time on internet forums when they were first coming up, and who were molded by this debate between the Christians and the atheists.
Right.
The atheism that late Gen X, early millennials were so attached to seems to have simply collapsed and not worked, right? It's like Sam Harris is the last one. Like, even Richard Dawkins seems to have his doubts. But like, I remember at some point, like, the phrase "God so loved the world that he sacrificed his only son" just popped into my head and started popping up regularly. And I thought, wow, that's such an extraordinarily powerful idea. I don't know why, like, symbolically it moves me. The Lord of the Rings is like the most, in many senses, is like my Bible, right? It's the thing that transformed me as a child and set me on my life path. And it's loved by counterculture people, but it's actually a profoundly Christian story. And people don't understand it and don't understand the underlying grammar of it because they don't understand Christianity, and they don't know the Bible, and they don't know what it's in reference to. And so part of this is just like, well, I have to understand Christianity because it's where the West comes from. And I think as much as many people now feel like the West is corrupt and destructive and terrible, I think we really underrate how great it has been and how much it has to donate to a positive future. And in order to understand that, I think you have to understand Christianity.
And so it's like maybe there's a God-shaped hole in the human psyche, and we can't escape searching for it. And maybe within any community that starts getting people towards something very meaningful, there's a pastor-shaped hole that needs to be filled.
Yeah.
And so having a way of beginning to learn the best practices for that is a good conversation to have. So that's an interesting start.
Okay, so I'm going to explain my idea about non-theistic Christianity for a second. So I have questions on each level, but it looks to me like there are, let's say, 2 levels of implicit Christianity and 3 levels of explicit Christianity. And it doesn't have to be Christianity. It could be any religion, right? So
the first level of implicit Christianity would be, let's say that Christianity lays out a moral ethic, right? Or a direction for your life. And you could be completely unaware of that ethic as being specifically Christian. You could be completely culturally divorced from it, and yet you could live towards it, right? You could live in a society where polygyny is accepted and choose to be monogamous, right? You could practice agapic love towards your neighbors despite never having heard the concept.
Yep.
Right. And I, if I'm correct, and you obviously know this better than I do, that's how a lot of theologians viewed the sort of virtuous ancients, right?
Yep.
They viewed them as implicitly Christian,
yep.
as having lived out Christian lives.
Yep.
Okay. So that's the implicit layer, number one. And when I look at my own life and I look at what I saw played out in the counterculture and what I chose not to buy into and what I chose to act out in the way that I formed a family and married and tried to act in the businesses that I did, I say, I kind of would like to think that I've been a decent Christian, right?
Yep.
From a moral ethical level. That seems like an admirable thing. And I'm not sure that I have another thing that I could describe as more admirable. So that's layer number one. Layer number two is, and this one's a killer for me, and I don't understand it completely, but layer number two is religions provide a cultural grammar that informs the metaphors that we use, that informs the institutions that we create, that informs the norms that we have, that structures our reality. And that thing has been around for 2,000 years, giving rise to all these aspects of the West that we take for granted, and we don't know. We don't know where that ends, right? Like, I listened to Steven Pinker talk to Jordan Peterson, and he was sort of like, well, it kind of just arises, everything that's good about the West arises sui generis in 1700 with Descartes and Kant. And I mean, maybe Christianity had some role to play, but, to me, it just looks like the same medieval superstition as everywhere else, right? And I'm like, maybe, like that doesn't seem like a very deeply thought out perspective to me, all right? And I understand why someone would come through it, because like I remember the evangelical creationist battles of the 1990s, and you could be like, well, clearly that thing isn't the thing that gave rise to what we're trying to do, right? But that just doesn't satisfy me, and so I think there's incredible brilliance and wisdom in Buddhism, and I'm also very, very skeptical that you can graft it onto Western society in anything like a direct sort of rational way. Like it could grow within Western society and become a thing, but I don't think it's like, wait, we're all Buddhists now. Like I'm very skeptical that that's a thing. Like I saw a bunch of white people try to do that with Sasiwas when I was in my teens, and I didn't think they were very successful. So that's number two. So then on the explicit layer, you could say, without accepting any of the supernatural claims, you could believe that Christ was a great moral teacher, and that his exemplar was something that you would want to act out. And then you could try to act that out explicitly, right? And then the next layer is you enter into a practice with other Christians of doing it. And this is where the Pajot conversation with Peterson was so interesting to me, because that's very scary to me.
Why?
Why? Can we come back to why?
Absolutely.
Come back to why. And then there is accepting the Christian epistemology or ontology of the nature of being and what that story of Christ's death and resurrection means, right? What does it mean to say that is real, right? And this is where I'm like, I don't think that Peterson would describe himself in the same way that I do, but I think that we're fundamentally in the same place, that we accept the three layers, that we're intrigued by the fourth layer, but haven't yet been able to act on it, and that we can't really accept the fifth layer. I'm interested in having these conversations about what is in this heritage and how do we wrestle with it, right? I think that's the right question, right? How do we wrestle with the heritage of our religious background and realize this is a sort of a hard turn, but I think that, James Lindsay's argument that we're facing a kind of religious awakening in the social justice movement, and that it is a religious awakening that is not aware of what it is or what it comes from, and that probably makes it quite dangerous, or I think sure makes it dangerous. I'm not satisfied with the Sam Harris argument that we can just get rid of this, or the Steven Pinker argument that the Enlightenment arises sui generis and that the things that come before it don't have anything to do with how it arises. And I don't think that we can solve the problems that we're facing without it. And I think that the principle of agape is a stronger principle to orient yourself around than anything that's been proposed otherwise. So whether we accept the resurrection or we don't accept the resurrection, if we throw that baby out with the bathwater, I think we're throwing out, if we throw logos and agape out with the Christian bathwater, I think that we collapse.